The first time I realized I was falling in love with Malcolm, it didn't hurt. That should have scared me, because before that, every feeling I'd ever had, for boys, started with a racing heart and ended with the sensation of someone sucking the air out of my chest. I was used to love meaning anxiety, desire coming with hurt, and intimacy always having an expiration date. But with Malcolm, it wasn't like that. We were sprawled out on the grass behind the social sciences building, in the late afternoon of our sophomore fall semester. Malcolm had his head pillowed on his backpack, eyes half closed, one hand on his stomach, the other idly twirling a blade of grass. I sat beside him, back against a tree, reading a book but not turning a page for 10 minutes. "Porter," he said, without opening his eyes, "do you ever think it's possible to love someone without having to suffer?" I froze. The question hung in the air, light as the breeze but heavy as a taboo. I looked at his profile, the sharp jawline, the lightly tanned skin, the slightly furrowed brows, as if he were asking himself too. "I don't know," I replied. "I think love always hurts somehow." Malcolm opened his eyes, turned his head to look at me. His gaze wasn't probing, wasn't challenging, just a steady presence. "I don't believe that." And in that moment, amid the rustling leaves, the distant laughter of students, I understood I'd stepped into something very different, something unhurried, not intense, but deep enough that I couldn't pretend it didn't exist. If I go back to the beginning, I'd say it all started on a very ordinary day. My name is Porter. I was a freshman philosophy major at a public university in the American West. I lived in the dorms, drank too much coffee, and always carried a list of things not to do, including falling for another guy. Malcolm entered my life in the third week of the semester, in a completely unromantic way. The library was packed. I was sitting on the floor, back against a bookshelf because there were no tables left. Malcolm stood in front of me, arms full of thick books. "Sorry," he said. "Mind if I sit here? I think my legs are about to give out." I looked up, saw a half smile. I shrugged, and so Malcolm sat down next to me, too close for two strangers. We studied in silence for nearly an hour. Malcolm read quickly, took concise notes. I paused often, my thoughts wandering. When I stood up to leave, he asked, "You studying philosophy?" I nodded. "I'm in psych," he said. "Seems like our fields should talk more." I smiled, and so we talked. Just little bits about tough professors, too early morning classes, how college wasn't like the admissions brochures. Malcolm didn't ask if I had a boyfriend, didn't ask if I was straight, didn't pry. He let things unfold slowly, naturally, like how a good song finds its way to your ears. We started spending time together, without labeling the relationship, without drawing lines. Malcolm sat next to me in big lectures, brought me coffee when I forgot breakfast, listened to me talk about fears I'd never named. I realized I trusted him before I realized I liked him. And that's what scared me, because trusting someone, for me, was always more dangerous than loving. Trust meant letting them into the rare safe space I'd spent years building. One night, sitting on the dorm steps, Malcolm said softly, "Porter, if one day you want to take a step forward, I won't pull you, but I won't disappear either." I didn't answer. I just looked down at my shoes. But inside, for the first time in a long while, there was no feeling of impending shatter. Just one clear, calm thought. Maybe this love won't hurt me. There's one thing I didn't tell Malcolm even when we got closer than study buddies who met by chance. Being with him, I didn't have to brace myself to exist. We didn't enter this relationship with a clear declaration. No "what are we" moment. No first handhold labeled meaningful. Everything flowed like water. Quiet, steady. Seeping through cracks in my life I didn't even know I'd left open. Malcolm started showing up in the small details. He remembered I hated eating breakfast alone. So every Monday he'd text, "I'm in the cafeteria. If you're hungry." He didn't say, "Come eat with me." He left me the choice. He listened to me talk about my old relationship, a senior guy who'd taught me how to love and also how to stay silent when abandoned without jumping in with advice. Malcolm just asked, "Back then, did you feel like you had to change to stay?" I nodded. He exhaled slowly. "I think If it hurts that much to keep someone, maybe it's not love. He said it lightly, like commenting on the weather. But in me, it created a crack. Not of hurt, but of realization. We spent many evenings in empty study rooms. Malcolm often sat across from me, feet propped on a chair, pen tucked between his fingers. He studied focused, but always noticed when I zoned out. "Porter," he'd call. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking. If people understood each other a little more, maybe the world would be less cruel." Malcolm smiled. "Sounds very philosophical. And you?" "I'm thinking you should sleep more." Those moments weren't intense. No fireworks. But they made me feel safe in a way I'd never felt before. Safe to not have to prove I was worth loving. One late October evening, the weather turned cold faster than expected. We were walking around the nearly empty campus. Streetlights cast golden glows on leaf-strewn paths. Malcolm wore a thicker jacket than me but said nothing. When the wind picked up, he slowed, stepping closer to me. Our shoulders brushed. That was it. But my heart beat like it had just been called by name. I didn't pull away. Malcolm didn't push further. That light touch existed just enough, not demanding, not crossing boundaries. And I understood something important. Malcolm always let me set the pace. When I told my roommate about it, a straight, loud guy who thought love had to be intense, he asked, "So what are you two? Anyway?" Took me a few seconds to answer. "I think we're learning how to be together." Malcolm wasn't the type to overwhelm me. He didn't make me forget the past. He made the past stop controlling the present. One afternoon, sitting in a small off-campus cafe, Malcolm suddenly asked, "Porter, are you afraid of me?" I looked up. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that I'll hurt you too." The question wasn't an apology for something undone. It was raw honesty. I looked into his eyes. "I am," I said, "but not because of you. I'm afraid because I'm not preparing an escape anymore." Malcolm nodded. "Then, if you need to slow down, I'll match your speed." No one had ever said that to me before. That night, Malcolm slept over in my room for the first time. Nothing beyond a loose hug on the narrow dorm bed. He turned his back to me, leaving enough space. I lay there, listening to his even breathing, and realized I wasn't tense. Not anxious. Not wondering if he'd vanish tomorrow. I just felt peace. And in that peace, a quiet but clear emotion was growing. The desire to stay. Maybe love doesn't always start with freefall. Maybe sometimes it starts with planting your feet and realizing this ground doesn't hurt. The strangest thing between Malcolm and me was, we never named this relationship. Not out of avoidance, not out of fear, but because it seemed unnecessary. We existed in a very soft in-between, not purely friends, not yet lovers, but close enough that old boundaries felt outdated. Malcolm started leaving his things in my room. A psychology book with underlined passages. A dark blue t-shirt, a size bigger than mine. A ceramic mug with his department's logo. Small things that outsiders might think were just convenient. But I knew they were signs of staying. I didn't return them. Malcolm didn't ask. We studied together more. Not just for convenience, but because we worked better side by side. Malcolm grounded my tangled thoughts. I helped him question things he'd taken for granted. "Do you think people can change completely?" Malcolm asked during a late study night. I propped my chin. "I think they can learn to live differently, but the scars stay." Malcolm was quiet for a bit. "That's good. I don't want to become someone entirely different." That made me realize Malcolm never tried to become someone to fit me, and he didn't expect me to do that. We started touching more. A brush on the wrist when he handed me a pen. Once, I rested my head on his shoulder in the library when too tired. One rainy evening, Malcolm put his arm around my back to pull me from a puddle. Neither of us said anything after those times. But I started noticing my body reacting differently. Not withdrawing, not guarding. Just a quiet acceptance. Once, waking at midnight and seeing Malcolm still there. Steady breath, hand between us like a soft boundary. I suddenly thought, if this is love, it's not noisy. But the outside world wasn't as quiet. One afternoon, sitting on the steps near the basketball courts, a group of students passed. A lingering glance, a vague whistle, no clear words, but enough to chill my spine. I pulled my hand back unconsciously. Malcolm noticed immediately. He didn't grab my hand, didn't ask, just leaned slightly to shield me. A small, instinctive gesture. Later, when it was just us, Malcolm said, "If you want distance in public, I understand." "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "It's not because of you. I know." He looked at me. "And I don't need you to be braver than you can be." No one had ever said that to me. That night, I told Malcolm about the first time I came out about liking a guy, and the price I paid. I told it without looking at him, afraid of pity. But Malcolm just sat there, listening, nodding occasionally. When I went silent, he said, "You're not weak for being afraid. You just learned how to survive." For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of my past. We started having deeper conversations about family, childhood, things hard to say. Malcolm told me about his mom, who always believed love needed nurturing, not testing. I told him about growing up in a small town, where silence was sometimes safer than truth. "Do you think," I asked, "that if things keep going like this, it'll change us?" Malcolm thought, "I think it'll clarify who we are." That night, when Malcolm slept over, I watched him for a long time. Not with burning desire, but with a strange feeling, like standing before a house with warm lights, and for the first time thinking about stepping in. I still hadn't named this love, but I knew one thing for sure. I was very close to something I no longer wanted to run from. One morning, I woke up and realized Malcolm was lying very close to me. Not touching, not holding, but close enough that his warmth seeped through the thin t-shirt, close enough that if I moved a little more, the distance would vanish. My heart raced. I lay still, staring at the familiar cracks in the dorm ceiling, and suddenly realized, this was the first time I didn't feel like I had to shrink to fit someone else. I didn't need to pretend calm, didn't need to stay in escape-ready mode. Malcolm opened his eyes, looked at me, smile still sleepy. "Morning. Morning," I replied. Nothing happened after. We brushed our teeth together, drank coffee, walked to class. Everything so normal it was surprising. But that normality confused me more than any dramatic moment. That afternoon I had an ethics philosophy class. The professor talked about care, not just actions but attitudes. I took notes quickly, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought of Malcolm, of how he always asked if I'd eaten, of how he never used care to control. I wondered, was I ready to take another step? The question followed me all afternoon, until we met in our usual study room. Malcolm watched me for a bit, then said, "You're thinking a lot." I exhaled. "Maybe. Want to talk?" I nodded, and for the first time, I let myself say what I'd avoided all along. "I'm scared," I said. "Not of you, but that if I take another step, I'll lose what we have." Malcolm listened. "No interruptions." When I stopped, he said slowly, "Porter, I don't think good things vanish just because we name them right." I looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure about a lot," he smiled. "But I'm sure I don't want you stuck in limbo just to feel safe." That wasn't pressure. It was an open door. That evening we didn't study. We walked around campus under a rare starry city sky. The air cold but not harsh. Malcolm slowed to walk beside me. I took a deep breath. "Malcolm, yeah, I think I like you more than I've let myself admit." Malcolm stopped. He turned to me, eyes serious but gentle. "I know." I blinked. "You know?" "Yeah. And me too." No fireworks. No soundtrack. Just us standing there, on the empty path, with a truth finally spoken. Malcolm didn't kiss me right away. He asked, "Can I hug you?" I nodded. His arms around me were just tight enough. Not possessive. Not trapping. I pressed my forehead to his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent. Soap, cold wind, a hint of coffee. In that moment, I understood. Intimacy isn't taking each other's space, but sharing it. When we pulled apart, Malcolm whispered, "We don't have to rush." "I know," I replied. And for the first time, that doesn't scare me. That night, we lay beside each other. This time, I reached out first. Malcolm laced his fingers with mine, gently as if it were the most natural thing. I closed my eyes, feeling our breaths sink. Maybe love doesn't always come to change us. Maybe sometimes it comes to show us that we don't have to shrink anymore. Everything changed after we acknowledged what existed between us, but not in the way I'd once feared. No boundaries broken. No hubo confusión. Just things became clearer, like a room already softly lit, now with someone pulling the curtains open a bit more. Malcolm started calling me my person when talking to his close friends. Not boyfriend, not partner, just a word private enough to make me feel chosen, but not boxed in. I was slower. I hadn't called him anything in front of others. Not out of shame, but because I was still learning to trust that I didn't need to hide this good thing. We started appearing together more. In the library, in the cafeteria, at school outdoor movie nights. No hand-holding, no arm around waists, but always close, an unmistakable closeness. People noticed. Some didn't. One Friday afternoon, sitting in an off-campus burger joint, a girl from Malcolm's class passed by, stopped, looked at us and smiled. You two look really good together. I tensed for a split second. Malcolm smiled back. Thanks. She left. I still hadn't breathed evenly. Malcolm looked at me. You okay? I think so. He nodded. If ever not, say so. I don't want you bearing it alone. I realized Malcolm didn't just love me romantically. He loved me responsibly, with my emotions at my pace. One evening, in my room, laptops open to an old movie neither really watched. Malcolm lay on his side, head on my chest, my hand on his back, a position months ago I couldn't imagine. Porter, Malcolm said softly, have you ever thought about kissing me? I laughed lightly, not because the question was silly, but because he asked like it needed careful consideration. Yes, I answered honestly. So, do you want to? I was silent a few seconds, not evading, listening to myself. Yes, I said again. Ido. Malcolm shifted up a bit. He didn't rush, didn't dive in. Our lips touched lightly, a kiss like confirmation more than desire. No tang, no dominance. Just two people checking if this was safe. And it was. I didn't shake, didn't freeze. I put my hand on his cheek, feeling the real warmth. When we parted, Malcolm smiled. That was okay. Yeah, I said. Very okay. That kiss didn't make me lose control. It made me present. After that, things progressed naturally. We kissed more, still light, still slow. Malcolm always looked at me after, like asking, you still okay? And I always nodded. But the world isn't always as gentle as Malcolm. One noon, sitting on the grass, Malcolm's hand on my thigh, very lightly, a group of students passed. A giggle, a small but audible word. Faggot. I pulled back. Malcolm said nothing right away. When they were gone, he asked, want to go inside? I nodded. In my room, I sat silent for a long time. Malcolm sat beside, not touching me. Finally, I said, I hate that this still affects me. Malcolm turned. Porter, that doesn't make you weak. It just proves the world still has a lot to learn. He put his hand on mine. We don't need to prove anything to them. For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed for wanting protection. I just felt with someone on my side, and I started to understand. Love that doesn't hurt isn't because it has no challenges, but because we don't face those challenges alone. There's one thing I never said out loud, even in Malcolm's arms. I'm not afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of losing the version of myself with you. That version is lighter, less defensive, dares to expect a little more. And for me, expecting was always a double-edged sword. The semester entered its final stretch. Campus tensed in the familiar way. Students staying up later, stronger coffee, conversations in short bursts. Malcolm and I got busier too, but somehow we still found our way back to each other. Some evenings we didn't talk much, just sat side by side, each with a book. Malcolm would lightly touch my foot with his under the table, a small signal he was there. And strangely, that was enough to refocus me. One night, struggling with a philosophy essay on happiness, Malcolm read my draft. "You write like happiness is something you need permission for," he said. I looked up. Maybe because I've always thought it wasn't for me. Malcolm set the essay down. "Porter, do you think you deserve good things?" The question silenced me. Not because I didn't understand, but because I'd never allowed myself to answer. "I'm learning," I said finally. Malcolm smiled. "That's enough." That weekend, Malcolm dragged me to a small gathering at his friend's apartment. Just a few people, golden lights, soft jazz. I hesitated long before agreeing. Not afraid of them, but afraid of being introduced as part of Malcolm's life. But he didn't introduce me with any label. Just simply, "This is Porter." And the way he stood beside me, naturally, comfortably, made me understand I didn't need to become something else to be there. At one point, amid lively chatter, Malcolm leaned in. "You okay?" I nodded. And this time I really was. That night, back in the room, I kissed him first. Deeper than before, but not rushed. Malcolm responded, hand on my waist. Steady, not possessive. When we stopped, foreheads touching, Malcolm whispered, "I really like when you take the lead." I smiled softly. "I'm practicing believing I have the right to." We didn't go further. Not from lack of desire, but because we understood intimacy didn't need to race. We lay beside each other, talking about real things, dream jobs, where to live after graduation. "Do you think we'll still be together after we graduate?" I asked, voice small enough to surprise myself. Malcolm was quiet. "I don't know the future," he said honestly, "but I know this present. I want to be here, with you." For the first time, that answer didn't unsettle me. I realized, happiness isn't a guarantee of forever. It's safety in the current moment, and trusting that moment is enough. The next morning, I woke before Malcolm. Sunlight through the blinds drew thin, bright lines on his face. I watched him sleep, and instead of fearing the day he'd leave, I just felt grateful he was here. Maybe love isn't gambling with pain. Maybe with the right person. Love is simply daring to believe you're allowed to be happy. I realized I'd changed on a very ordinary morning. We were in line for coffee before class. The place crowded, noisy. Espresso scent sharp enough to sting. Malcolm behind me, one hand holding a hot paper cup, the other lightly on my back, just enough to let me know he was there. A year ago, I'd have brushed that hand away immediately. But this time, I did nothing. I stood still, letting the moment exist. And what surprised me wasn't the stares from others, but that I no longer noticed them. We started appearing as a couple, not flashy, not announced, but clear. Malcolm walked me to his classes. I waited for him to finish for lunch. Some guessed, some asked outright. We didn't evade, but didn't explain more than needed. A girl in my class asked, "You two are?" I glanced at Malcolm for a second. He didn't jump in, didn't answer for me. He gave me space to choose. "Yeah," I said. "We're together." Just 2 words. But they didn't make me tremble. That evening, alone, Malcolm hugged me from behind. "You don't know how much that means to me."
"Ido," he replied.
"Because it means something to me too." But not hiding anymore didn't mean everything suddenly got easy. At semester's end, Malcolm faced a family issue. His mom hospitalized from exhaustion. Not life-threatening, but enough for him to go home a few days. I saw him off at the bus stop, cold wind whipping through coats. "You don't have to come," Malcolm said. "It's freezing." "I want to," I replied. We hugged long. For the first time since knowing Malcolm, the old fear rose, the fear of losing what I had. Malcolm noticed. He cupped my cheek. "Porter, I'll be back." I nodded. "I know." But as he boarded, my heart tightened. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I realized how important he'd become. The days Malcolm was gone, campus felt oddly empty. I studied, wrote, went about normally, but everything missed a familiar rhythm. We texted every night. Not long, not mushy. Just, "How was your day?" "I'm good. Miss you." I didn't panic. didn't doubt, and that made me realize I'd truly changed. When Malcolm returned, I was studying in the room. Door opened. He stood there, tired, but smiling. I stood, walked over, hugged him tight. "Welcome home," I said, then froze at my own words. Malcolm chuckled softly, hugging tighter. "Yeah, home." That night, beside each other, we talked about more serious things. Future, lingering fears. Malcolm didn't promise forever. I didn't demand. But one thing I said clearly: I don't want to go back to being the person who always runs. Malcolm kissed my forehead. "And you don't have to." For the first time, I understood courage isn't being fearless. Courage is staying even knowing you could get hurt. And I stayed. The semester ended in a long exhale. Campus emptied. Trees bare. Mornings without rushed class bells. Malcolm and I entered the time I'd always feared most. The lull after the peak, when things risk becoming fragile. But this time, the lull didn't swallow us. We spent more time together, not because less busy, but because we wanted. Lazy mornings. Aimless afternoon walks. Evenings cooking in the dorm kitchen. Malcolm chopping onions while I washed dishes. Both laughing at nothing. One evening, on the bed, soft desk light, Malcolm suddenly said, "I used to think love had to hurt to be real." I turned to him. "And now I think real love makes you breathe easier." I went silent. My heart beat slow, steady. I told Malcolm about old relationships in more detail than before. About apologizing for my own emotions. About thinking I was a burden. Malcolm listened, then held my hand. "Porter," he said firmly, "you've never been a burden. You were just in the wrong place." That didn't erase the past, but it put the past where it belonged, behind me. A day before winter break, we stood on the dorm rooftop. Cold wind, distant city lights. Malcolm's arm over my shoulders. I leaned my head on his chest, a gesture now instinctive. "Do you think," I asked, "that one day, things will get harder?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. "Probably," he said, "but I don't think harder means painful." I smiled. "I like how you distinguish that." Malcolm leaned down, forehead to forehead. "I like how you've dared to trust again." That night, beside each other, I thought of the me from a year ago. Always wary, always prepping an exit. I didn't hate that person. I was grateful for him. But I also knew I didn't need to live like that anymore. I turned to Malcolm, whispered, "Thank you for not hurting me." Malcolm opened his eyes, looked at me, gaze warm. "Thank you for staying." We kissed, not passionately, just deep enough to affirm we were choosing each other, in this present. And in that moment, I understood the simplest thing. A love that doesn't hurt isn't one without shadows, but one